The moment the wolf's claws come down on the crib, I do something no 6-month-old baby should be able to do. I catch it. Bare hand. Bare skin. A claw the size of a kitchen knife, and I just wrap my fingers around it like it's a toy someone handed me. The beast freezes. It's confused. It should be. A baby isn't supposed to move that fast. A baby isn't supposed to move at all. Then the pain hits, and it isn't mine. It's the wolf's. I feel its whole life pour into me through that one point of contact. Every hunt, every kill, every night spent starving in the hollow reach. And for half a second, I'm not a baby anymore. I'm something else. Something older. Something that remembers dying. Because I did die. Once. In another life, in another body, as a grown man with a sword and a name that mattered. And now I'm 6 months old, lying in a crib made of pine, holding back an apex predator with a grip that shouldn't exist, and the only thought running through my infant brain is the same one that ran through my adult brain right before I died. Not like this. Not again. The wolf snaps its jaw an inch from my face. My mother is screaming in the doorway. My sister is screaming louder. And somewhere underneath all of that noise, something inside my tiny chest cracks open, and the wolf's strength stops being the wolf's strength. It becomes mine. I didn't ask for this. Nobody warns you that you're being reincarnated with a monster-eating curse sewn into your bones. Nobody hands you a manual. 1 second you're bleeding out on a battlefield you can't even remember clearly anymore, and the next you're a newborn, screaming in a farmhouse on the edge of the most dangerous forest in the kingdom, and something in your blood has decided that the way you survive now is by devouring the things that try to kill you. That was the night everyone in Ashcombe Hollow found out their new baby wasn't normal. It was also the night I found out exactly what I was. And trust me, the story only gets worse from here. Or better, depending on how you feel about babies casually absorbing the powers of apex predators before they can even walk. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part before the crib. In my last life, I was a man named Dorian Kestrel. I hunted monsters for a living, out on the borderlands where the kingdom's maps just stop pretending to know what's out there. I was good at it. Not the best, but good enough that people paid extra to have me on their caravan when they crossed the Hollow Reach. That stretch of black forest where the trees grow wrong and the things living in them grow worse. I spent 15 years killing beasts so merchants could sleep at night. And then, on one very ordinary escort job, an Apex-class horror came out of the tree line that nobody had a name for yet, and it tore through 6 of us like we were made of paper. I was the 7th. I remember shoving a merchant's kid behind a wagon wheel. I remember the weight of the thing's foot on my chest. I remember thinking, so this is how it ends. No glory, no last words, just mud and blood and the smell of something ancient standing over me. And then nothing. Just black. For what felt like no time at all. Then I was crying. Except the cry wasn't coming from a grown man's throat. It was high-pitched and small and utterly humiliating, and I was wrapped in a blanket in a stranger's arms, and the stranger was calling me Rowen. Rowen Vane. That's the name they gave this new body. A newborn boy, born to a widow named Elsa Vane, in a border village called Ashcombe Hollow, which, in a joke I did not appreciate at the time, sits right up against the edge of the same cursed forest that killed me in my last life. Of all the places to get reborn, the universe picked the one spot on the map I already knew was a death trap. My father was already gone before I was born. Bastian Vane, another hunter, killed months earlier during what the village calls the Veil Surge, a night when the boundary of the Hollow Reach thinned, and every nightmare inside it tried to walk out at once. My mother raised my older sister Ren alone through her whole pregnancy, and then I showed up. And suddenly, she had 2 children and no husband, and a house that backed directly onto a forest that ate people for sport. I didn't remember any of this at first. Newborn brains are useless. It took months for the memories of Dorian Kestrel to surface, drip by drip, like water through a cracked ceiling. First, I remembered dying. Then I remembered the years before that. Then I remembered everything. all stacked inside a baby's skull that had absolutely no idea what to do with an adult man's trauma. So there I was, a baby with a dead hunter's memories, lying in a crib, slowly realizing that reincarnation was real and deeply unfair. When the wolf came through the window. It was a hollow fang, one of the smaller apex breeds that hunt the tree line at night, drawn in by the scent of a newborn. In my old life, I'd killed 2 of them and nearly died doing it both times. As Rowen Vane, 6 months old, I had none of Dorian's muscle, none of his reflexes, none of his sword. What I had was instinct, screaming at me that something with teeth was about to end this new life before it even started. That's when my hand moved on its own. That's when I grabbed the claw. And that's when the pull started. This awful, hungry pull, like my body had a mouth I didn't know about, and it had just found something to eat. The wolf's strength drained into me in seconds. Its speed, its night vision, the memory of every rabbit and deer and unlucky traveler it had ever hunted, all of it, funneling straight into my chest like I was some kind of drain. The beast shriveled as it happened, muscle wasting off its frame, until what hit the nursery floor wasn't a predator anymore. It was a husk, a dried-out coat of fur that used to be dangerous. My mother burst in half a second later and found her infant son sitting up in the crib, wide awake, staring at a dead monster with eyes that were far too calm for a baby who'd just watched something die inches from his face. Ren, my sister, 4 years old at the time, took one look at the scene and did the only sensible thing a 4-year-old could do. She started screaming that the baby was a witch. She wasn't wrong to be scared. I wasn't a witch, but I also wasn't just a baby anymore, and everyone in that house knew it. The village healer came the next morning to check on me, half convinced my mother was exaggerating from exhaustion. He left an hour later, pale as a sheet, muttering about curses and bloodlines and things men aren't supposed to survive touching. Word got around fast in a place as small as Ashcombe Hollow. By the end of the week, half the village was calling me blessed, and the other half was calling me cursed, and nobody could agree on which one was worse. Here's the part I figured out slowly, over the next few years, piecing it together the way you'd piece together a puzzle with half the edges missing. Whatever happened to me in the space between dying as Dorian and waking up as Rowen didn't just hand me a second chance. It handed me a hunger. A very specific, very dangerous hunger. Every time a monster's claw, tooth, or raw power came into contact with mine, and I let it, I could pull the ability out of the creature and into myself. Strength, speed, venom, regeneration. Whatever the beast had, I could take, and the beast would never get it back. The healer had a name for it, an old word from a book nobody had opened in decades. The devourer's mark. Apparently it used to show up once every few generations, always on the border villages, always in someone who ended up either saving their town or burning it down. Nobody could tell me which one I'd be. Honestly, at 4 years old, still getting my legs to work properly while an adult man's memories rattled around in my skull, I wasn't sure either. What I did know was this. Every time I fed on a monster's ability, something of the monster stayed behind in me. A flicker of its hunger, a shadow of its instinct. Not enough to change who I was, not at first, but enough that I could feel it sitting there, patient, waiting for a reason to grow. My mother didn't know that part. Ren didn't know that part. I kept it to myself, because the last thing this family needed was one more reason to be afraid of me. So I grew up carefully. I learned to walk like a normal boy, even though Dorian's old instincts made me faster than any child should be. I learned to speak slowly, even though a grown man's vocabulary was sitting right there behind my teeth, itching to come out. I learned to smile at the other village kids, even when they whispered behind my back, because whispers I could survive. Being dragged off by an angry mob of superstitious farmers, I could not. And for a while, it almost worked. For a while, I got to be just a strange, quiet boy in a small border village, playing at swords with sticks, while secretly already knowing exactly how to kill a man twice his size. For a while, the only thing that mattered was keeping my mother's smile on her face and keeping Ren from flinching every time I walked into a room. It didn't stay that way. It never does in a village like Ashcombe Hollow, sitting on the edge of a forest that never stopped trying to get in. By the time I was 7, the attacks on the village had gotten worse, not better. Where there used to be one Vale surge every few years, there were now 2 or 3 a season, small tremors in the forest that sent lesser monsters spilling toward the farms. Livestock went missing, fences got torn open by things with too many claws. And every single time, I was the only person in Ashcombe Hollow who could look at the wreckage and understand exactly what kind of creature had done it. Because some buried part of me still remembered the taste of that kind of monster from a life I wasn't supposed to remember at all. I started sneaking out. Not far, not at first, just to the tree line, just to watch. Dorian's old hunting instincts wouldn't let me sit still while something dangerous was moving that close to my family. My mother caught me twice and grounded me both times, terrified out of her mind that her 7-year-old was going to get himself killed playing at monsters. She had no idea her 7-year-old had already killed monsters, in a different body, in a different life, more times than she could count. The third time she caught me sneaking back through the fence, she wasn't angry anymore. She was crying. That hit harder than any scolding could have. I remember standing there, soaked from the rain, watching my mother's shoulders shake, and thinking that whatever this curse was, whatever this power was, it wasn't worth it if it cost her one more sleepless night. I promised her I'd stop. I broke that promise within a month, because the forest doesn't care about promises, and neither did the thing that came out of it next. It was late autumn, the air already biting cold, when the alarm bell in the village square started ringing in the middle of the afternoon. Ashcombe Hollow only had one bell, and it only rang for one reason. Something had breached the tree line in broad daylight, which never happened, because most of the Hollow Reach's monsters hated sunlight almost as much as they hated silver. This one didn't care about sunlight. This one came straight through the fence at the edge of the Torvald farm, a boar-shaped horror twice the size of a cart horse, tusks like curved swords, hide like cracked stone. The village's hunters, 4 of them, all older, all more experienced on paper than a 7-year-old boy had any business being, went out to meet it. I watched from the fence line, and I knew within seconds that all 4 of them were about to die. I was right. 2 went down in the first exchange, gutted before they could even raise their spears. A third got thrown clean through a fence post. The 4th, an older man named Garen Voss, the closest thing the village had to a real veteran, held the line alone, bleeding from a gash across his ribs, buying time for people to run. He wasn't going to win. I could see it from 50 feet away. And something in me, some leftover piece of Dorian Kestrel, who used to run toward exactly this kind of fight instead of away from it, refused to just stand there and watch a good man die in front of a bunch of children who'd already lost too many fathers to this forest. So I did the single stupidest thing a 7-year-old with a monster-eating curse could possibly do. I ran straight at it. Garen screamed at me to get back. The boar thing didn't even register me as a threat, not at first, not until I was close enough to grab its tusk with both hands the way I'd grabbed that wolf's claw years earlier in my crib. The pull hit instantly, harder than it ever had before, because this thing was bigger, older, meaner, and it fought the drain with everything it had. For one terrifying second, I thought it was going to win. I thought the hunger inside me had finally bitten off more than it could chew, and I was about to become a smear on the Torvald family's fence. Then the balance tipped. The boar's strength poured into me in a rush that felt like drowning and flying at the same time, and its hide, that same stone-cracked hide, started forming along my own skin in patches, and its screech turned into a whimper, and then it just stopped moving altogether. Silence. Just my ragged breathing, and Garen staring at me like he'd watched a ghost. Which, in a way, he had. That was the day the whole village found out what I could do, out loud, in the open, with no way to pretend it was rumor or exaggeration anymore. A 7-year-old boy had just killed an Apex-class monster with his bare hands, in front of witnesses, and walked away with patches of stone-hard skin still fading from his arms. My mother's face when she reached me was a mixture I'll never forget. Relief, terror, and something else underneath both of those. Something that looked almost like recognition, like some part of her had always suspected there was more to her son than a strange, quiet boy who liked watching the tree line too much. Word of what happened at the Torvald farm didn't stay inside Ashcombe Hollow. It couldn't. A village hunter surviving an Apex-class horror was news. A 7-year-old killing one bare-handed was the kind of story that traveled on its own legs, farm to farm, road to road, until it reached exactly the kind of person you never want hearing a story like that. His name was Lord Draven Kesh, and he ran the region from a fortified manor 2 days' ride from our village, and his entire fortune was built on one very simple, very ugly business: monster cores. The concentrated essence left behind when an Apex-class beast dies with its power intact, harvested and sold to alchemists and weaponsmiths for obscene amounts of gold. The problem with my fight at the fence line was that I hadn't left a core behind. I'd eaten it. There was nothing left of that boar thing for Lord Kesh's men to harvest and sell, and that, more than anything, is what got his attention. He sent a rider within the month, a polished, smiling man in Kesh colors, who asked a lot of very casual questions about the boy who killed a monster with his hands, and left with a lot of very careful non-answers from my mother, who by then had figured out exactly how dangerous this kind of attention could be for her son. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was 8 years old, still adjusting to a body that kept growing stronger in ways that scared even me, still trying to be a decent brother to Ren, who'd started, slowly, cautiously, letting me back into her life once she realized I wasn't some kind of monster wearing her brother's face. I had bigger things to worry about than one nobleman's curiosity. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Over the next 3 years, the pattern of my life became something like this: grow, train, quietly, in the woods just past the fence, using every scrap of Dorian's old technique my young body could handle, absorb whatever came at the village hard enough to threaten it, and there were more of those every season, not fewer, no matter what the village elders told themselves about the Hollow Reach calming down. And watch, carefully, as Lord Kesh's interest in Ashcombe Hollow shifted from curious to something closer to obsessive. By the time I was 10, I'd absorbed abilities from 11 different monsters. Speed from a pack-hunting fang, regeneration from something that used to be a bear before the forest got into it, a kind of poison resistance from a serpent the size of a cart that had nearly killed 2 farmhands before I got to it. Each one left a residue behind, a shadow of instinct sitting quiet in the back of my mind, and each one made the villagers look at me a little differently, somewhere between grateful and afraid. Ren was the only one who never looked at me afraid. If anything, she got protective, standing between me and anyone in the village who muttered the word curse a little too loud. She'd grown into someone sharper than most kids her age, quick with a knife she wasn't supposed to have, and quicker with a comeback that could shut down a bully twice her size. I loved her for it. I also worried, constantly, that being my sister was going to get her hurt one day, because trouble in this story doesn't just find me, it finds everyone standing close to me. That's exactly what happened the day Lord Kesh's son came to Ashcombe Hollow in person. Percival Kesh arrived with an escort of 6 soldiers, and an attitude that made it very clear he considered our entire village something slightly beneath the mud on his boots. He was maybe 13, a year or 2 older than me, dressed in fabric that probably cost more than every house on our street combined, and he'd come, officially, to inspect the village's tribute payments on his father's behalf. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly why he was really there. He wanted to see the monster-eating boy for himself. He found me at the market square, where Ren and I were helping load supplies onto a neighbor's cart. Percival took one look at me, unimpressed, and made a comment loud enough for the whole square to hear about how the great village prodigy looked like every other dirt-poor farm brat he'd ever seen. A few of his soldiers laughed. A few villagers looked away, embarrassed on my behalf. I didn't care. Words had stopped hurting me somewhere around my second life. Ren cared. Ren cared a lot. She stepped in front of him before I could stop her and told him, in front of his own soldiers, that at least dirt-poor farm brats didn't need 6 armed men to feel important. The square went dead silent. Percival's face went red, then white, then red again, and for one horrible second, I thought he was actually going to have his men grab her right there in the open street. That's when I stepped between them instead, and that's when everything went sideways. Percival, humiliated in front of his own escort by a girl half his size, turned his anger on the easiest target available, which was apparently me. He shoved me. Hard. Hard enough that a normal 10-year-old would have gone down in the dirt in front of the whole market. I didn't move an inch, and the look on his face when his shove did absolutely nothing was almost worth everything that came after it. Almost. Because that single moment, one noble's son publicly failing to budge one village boy, was the spark that lit the entire next stretch of my life on fire. Percival didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just stared at me with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn a version of it myself once, a long time ago, right before I threw myself at an Apex-class horror I had no business fighting. It was the look of someone who'd just decided this wasn't over. He rode back to his father's manor that same afternoon, and 3 weeks later, everything about Ashcombe Hollow started changing, in ways that had nothing to do with the forest, and everything to do with the man sitting comfortably behind its walls. The tribute demands doubled first, then tripled. Lord Kesh's collectors arrived with a new tax schedule that nobody in the village could actually afford, and when the elders tried to protest, the collectors made it very clear, without saying it outright, that the tax increase had everything to do with the village's failure to properly report and hand over monster cores harvested within its borders. Cores that I'd been eating instead of leaving behind for 3 years running. I understood immediately what was happening, even if the village elders didn't. This wasn't about tribute. This was Lord Kesh squeezing an entire village because his son had been embarrassed by a farm boy who ate monsters instead of selling their remains. And the message underneath the new taxes was as clear as a shout. Hand over the boy, or watch your village suffer for keeping him. My mother figured it out around the same time I did, and the look on her face when she did was the most afraid I'd ever seen her. More afraid than the night the wolf came through my nursery window. Because a monster, you can fight. A monster, I could eat. A nobleman with the full weight of the regional crown behind him, that was a different kind of threat entirely, and no amount of absorbed power was going to fix that with one clean punch. I spent that winter watching my family's savings drain away to cover taxes we shouldn't have owed, watching neighbors go hungry to make quota, watching Garen Voss, who'd become something like a second father to me since the day at the fence line, quietly train me harder than ever, in secret, at night, saying almost nothing about why except one line I never forgot. If they come for you, Rowen, you'd better be ready for more than one monster at a time. He was right to worry, because Lord Kesh wasn't just squeezing the village for money, he was preparing something worse, and none of us knew it yet, and that ignorance almost got every single person I loved killed. It started with the disappearances, small at first, easy to explain away. A hunting party that didn't come back from the tree line, blamed on a veil surge nobody could confirm. A shepherd's whole flock gone overnight, blamed on wolves. Then a whole outlying farmhouse, family included, simply gone, with the fences torn outward instead of inward. Like whatever came through hadn't broken in, it had broken out. Garen was the one who noticed the pattern first, because Garen had spent 30 years reading the Hollow Reach like a book. And this wasn't the forest's normal rhythm. This was something being pushed, deliberately, from somewhere deep inside the trees, in a direction that pointed straight at our village. He brought his suspicions to the village elders. They didn't want to hear it, because believing him meant admitting that Lord Kesh, the man they'd just spent a winter paying crushing taxes to, might be the reason monsters were suddenly boiling out of the forest faster than anyone had ever seen. Garen brought his suspicions to me instead, late one night, in the barn behind my mother's house, and what he told me changed the shape of everything. He'd heard rumors, from a trader who'd heard it from a guard, who'd heard it from someone inside Kesh's own manor, that the Lord had been funding something in the deep reach for years. Experiments. Alchemists paid obscene amounts of gold to figure out how to force monster evolution artificially, using captured cores, using forbidden rites nobody in the capital would ever approve of, all in the name of creating something that could be controlled, weaponized, sold to the highest bidder among the kingdom's rival lords. And every failed experiment, Garen said, every twisted, half-finished horror that didn't turn out the way Kesh's alchemists wanted, got released instead of destroyed. Released into the hollow reach. Released in the direction of the one village stubborn enough to keep hiding a boy who could eat monster cores whole and leave nothing behind for Kesh's men to profit from. I remember sitting in that barn, 10 years old in body, decades older in every way that mattered, and feeling something I hadn't felt since the moment Dorian Kestrel died under a monster's foot. Rage. Clean, focused, useful rage. Because this wasn't a forest problem anymore. This was a man. A specific man with a name and an address, deliberately feeding my home to monsters because his son got humiliated in a market square. That should have been the moment I ran to warn everyone. It wasn't. Because right as Garen finished talking, the alarm bell in the village square started ringing again. Except this time, it didn't stop. We ran outside to a sky-lit orange at the edges. Not from sunset, from fire. And the tree line at the far end of the village wasn't just shifting, it was breaking apart. Wood splintering outward in a wide arc, like something enormous had just decided the forest wasn't big enough for it anymore. Garen went pale in a way I'd never seen from him before. Not even at the fence line 3 years earlier. He'd seen a lot of monsters in 30 years of hunting. He said he'd never seen anything with a silhouette like that. I looked and understood exactly why. Because the thing stepping out of the broken tree line wasn't following any pattern I'd absorbed before. It was taller than the farmhouse behind it. Its skin shifted between shapes like it hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Patches of scale, patches of something closer to bark, patches that looked disturbingly close to human. Its eyes glowed the same unnatural gold as a monster core fresh from a kill. And it moved wrong, too fluid, too controlled, like something that had been built rather than born. This was one of Kesh's failed experiments, and it had just walked straight into the middle of Ashcombe Hollow. Villagers scattered in every direction. My mother grabbed Ren and screamed my name, and for one long, awful second, I stood frozen between the family I loved and the monster that could very easily kill every one of them, and every old instinct from Dorian's life screamed at me to run toward it anyway. The same way I had at 7 years old, the same way that had worked exactly once and might not work twice. Garen grabbed my shoulder before I could move, not to stop me, to tell me something, fast, low, urgent, the kind of thing a man only says when he thinks it might be the last thing he ever gets to say. He told me he'd hold the thing's attention as long as he could. He told me to get my family clear, and he told me one more thing. Something that hit harder than anything Kesh's soldiers or his monsters ever did. He told me he was proud of me, not despite the curse, because of what I'd chosen to do with it. Then he ran straight at the thing with a spear that was never going to be enough, and I did the only thing I could do, which was grab my mother and Ren and drag them toward the tree line on the opposite side of the village, away from the fire, away from the horror, away from the sound of Garen Voss screaming a war cry 30 years in the making. I got them to safety. I made sure of that first, because some promises matter more than pride. Then I turned around and ran back toward the fire, back toward the thing that had just swallowed a spear whole and was still standing, back toward the only man in this world who'd ever looked at my curse and called it a gift instead of a warning. I was too late for Garen. I want to tell this part slower, but there isn't a slow way to say it. By the time I reached the square, he was already down, and the horror was already turning toward the next building, the next family, the next set of screams it could add to the fire behind it. Something broke in me at that moment. Not the good kind of breaking, the kind that comes right before you stop caring whether you survive whatever happens next. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the way Dorian would have, weighing risk against reward the way a proper hunter should. I just ran, straight at a horror 3 times my size, built out of a dozen failed experiments and God knows how many stolen cores. and I grabbed the first part of it I could reach with both hands, and let the hunger inside me open all the way up for the first time in my life. The pull hit like nothing I'd ever felt before. This wasn't one monster's power draining into me. It was pieces of a dozen monsters, all stitched together, all fighting the drain at once, and for a moment, I genuinely believed this was how it ended, that I'd finally found the one thing my curse couldn't chew through, right in the middle of the village I'd spent my whole second life trying to protect. Then the balance shifted. Slowly at first, then all at once. The way a dam doesn't leak until suddenly it doesn't exist anymore. Power flooded into me faster than my body had any right to handle. Scale and bark and something disturbingly close to human intelligence. All of it pouring in while the horror shrieked in a dozen different voices that didn't belong to a single creature at all. When it finally went still, I was standing in the middle of a scorched square, surrounded by a village that had gathered to watch. Every single one of them staring at a 10-year-old boy, glowing faintly gold at the edges, breathing hard, alive, in front of the drained husk of the most dangerous thing Ashcombe Hollow had ever seen. Nobody cheered. Nobody screamed either. They just stared, in that particular kind of silence that happens when people realize the story they've been telling themselves about a strange local boy was smaller than the truth the whole time. I found my mother's eyes in the crowd first, then Ren's. Both of them were crying, and for once, I let myself believe it wasn't fear. Then I looked past them, at the smoking wreckage of the square, at Garen's body finally being lifted with the kind of gentle care you only give someone who died buying the rest of you time, and I felt that clean, focused rage from the barn come roaring back, sharper now, aimed at exactly one man who wasn't even standing in the village to see what he'd caused. Word of what happened that night reached Lord Kesh's manor within days, the same way word always did. Except this time, the story wasn't just about a boy who could kill monsters bare-handed. It was about a boy who'd absorbed one of his own failed experiments whole, survived it, and turned it into raw proof of exactly what he'd been trying to weaponize for years. I thought that would scare him off. I thought a man like Kesh would look at what happened at Ashcombe Hollow and decide the village and the boy in it weren't worth the trouble anymore. I was wrong about that too. Because 3 days after the funeral for Garen Voss, a formal rider arrived from the manor carrying a message with Lord Kesh's own seal, addressed personally to my mother, and what it said made it very clear that everything that had happened so far, the taxes, the disappearances, the monster at the edge of the village, had only ever been the opening move. He wasn't asking anymore. He was inviting Rowen Vane, by name, to the manor to discuss, as the letter so politely put it, a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding my future. And underneath that polite, careful, threatening little letter was one line that told me exactly what kind of arrangement he actually had in mind. He wanted what I could do. He wanted to own it, control it, sell it, or bury it, whichever turned out to be more profitable. And he'd already shown, twice now, once with taxes and once with a monster built out of stolen cores, exactly how far he was willing to go to get it. I stood in my mother's kitchen holding that letter, 10 years old, with a dead man's memories and a curse that had just eaten a monster built from human ambition, and I understood something with total clarity for the first time since I woke up crying in this new body. This was never going to end with one dead beast in a village square. Lord Kesh wasn't going to stop sending things after Ashcombe Hollow. He was going to keep sending them until either I was dead or I was his. I folded the letter, looked up at my mother's frightened face and my sister's furious one, and made a promise to both of them that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. I wasn't going to the manor to negotiate. I was going to make sure Lord Draven Kesh understood, personally, exactly what kind of monster he'd been trying to build all along, right before I took everything he'd spent years creating and made it mine. My mother tried to stop me. Of course she did. She'd already buried a husband to this border, and she wasn't ready to bury a son, too, especially not a son who still looked, on the outside, like a 10-year-old boy who should be worried about chores and not about noblemen with private armies. I told her the truth, or as much of it as I could fit into words. I told her that if I didn't go, Kesh would keep sending things after the village until there was nothing left to protect. Staying home wasn't safety. Staying home was just a slower version of the same ending. Ren didn't try to stop me at all. She packed a bag instead, quietly, while our mother argued. And when I found her by the door with her boots already laced, I knew there was no version of this where she let me go alone. I didn't fight her on it. Some arguments you don't win, and honestly, some part of me was grateful not to be doing this completely by myself. Garen would have argued for a plan. Garen would have argued for patience, for scouting the manor first, for waiting until I was older and stronger and less likely to get myself killed walking through a nobleman's front gate. Garen wasn't there anymore to argue anything, and that absence sat in my chest the entire 2-day walk to Kesh's manor, sharp and useful, the kind of grief that turns into fuel if you let it. We reached the manor gates on the evening of the second day, and I'll admit, for one small moment, the size of the place almost made me hesitate. Stone walls 3 times the height of any building in Ashcombe Hollow. Guards in matching colors posted every few dozen feet. Banners with the Kesh crest snapping in a wind that felt colder up here than it had any right to be. This was a man who'd built an empire on other people's dead monsters, and he'd built it well. The guards at the gate recognized my name before I even said it. That told me everything I needed to know about how badly Lord Kesh wanted this meeting. I was escorted, not dragged, not chained, escorted, straight through the front courtyard and into a hall bigger than my entire house, where Lord Draven Kesh sat waiting like he'd known the exact hour I'd arrive. He looked smaller than I expected. Not physically. Physically, he was a broad, heavy man, with the kind of posture that came from never once in his life worrying about where his next meal was coming from. Smaller in the sense that matters. Smaller the way every bully looks once you stop being afraid of them. Percival stood at his father's right side, and the look on his face when he saw me walk in on my own 2 feet, unafraid, was almost as satisfying as the shove I hadn't budged from 3 years earlier. Almost. Lord Kesh opened with pleasantries. Congratulations on surviving the incident at Ashcombe Hollow. Condolences for the loss of the village hunter, spoken with all the sincerity of a man reading off a shopping list. An offer, generous, he called it, for me to relocate to the manor, train under his personal alchemists, and lend my abilities to projects that would, in his words, benefit the entire region. I asked him, flat and quiet, whether those projects included the thing that walked out of the Hollow Reach 3 weeks earlier, wearing a dozen stolen cores like a costume. The room went very still. Percival's smug expression cracked first. Lord Kesh's took a little longer, but it cracked too, just for a second. Just long enough for me to see that I'd guessed exactly right, and that he hadn't expected a 10-year-old farm boy to walk into his hall and say it out loud in front of his own guards. He recovered fast. He always did. I'd learned that about him eventually. He said accidents happen during important research. He said Ashcombe Hollow's suffering was regrettable, but ultimately necessary. A small price for progress that would protect the whole kingdom eventually. He said it the way men like him always say things like that, like the math only ever works out in favor of the people doing the counting. That's when Ren, standing just behind me, said something I will never forget for as long as I live. Curse or no curse, first life or second. She told him that Garen Voss died holding a line so children could run, and that if progress needed men like Garen to die for it, then whatever Lord Kesh was building wasn't progress at all. It was just cruelty with better paperwork. Percival lunged for her before his father even finished reacting, some mix of embarrassment and fury finally boiling over 3 years late. And that was the mistake that ended this particular chapter of the story, because I wasn't 10 seconds too slow this time. I caught his wrist before it got anywhere near her, the same way I'd caught that wolf's claw as an infant, and I didn't drain anything. I didn't need to. I just held him there, easily, effortlessly, in front of his own father and every guard in the hall, until he understood exactly how far outmatched he actually was. Lord Kesh's guards moved. That was always going to happen eventually. What he didn't expect was that I'd already spent the whole walk here deciding exactly how this confrontation was going to go, and that Ren, quiet, sharp, furious Ren, had spent the same 2 days preparing something of her own. She'd carried, hidden in her travel bag the entire trip, a small collection of notes copied from the village archive, records the elders had kept for years without ever fully understanding what they proved, tax ledgers, disappearance reports, dates that lined up perfectly with every failed experiment released into the Hollow Reach. She threw them across the hall floor at the exact moment the guards closed in, loud enough that every servant, every guard, every witness in that room could see exactly what Lord Kesh had been funding with the coin he'd bled out of a starving border village. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Guards looked at their lord instead of at us, uncertain, because you can't unspeak a truth once it's sitting on the floor in plain ink for everyone to read. Lord Kesh broke the silence himself, and not with words. He shouted an order I didn't recognize at first, something aimed at a side door I hadn't noticed until it slammed open, and out of it came the reason his manor had walls 3 times higher than anything back home. A containment cage on wheels, reinforced with iron and something that hummed faintly gold, holding the one experiment he'd never dared release into the wild, his finished project. His answer to a village boy who ate monsters and left nothing behind to sell. It was worse than the thing that killed Garen. Bigger, more controlled, built with purpose instead of failure. Its shape somewhere between a man and every apex predator I'd ever absorbed, stitched together with intent. Lord Kesh had it dragged into the hall himself, hand on the release lever, and told me, almost gently, that I could still walk out of this the easy way. Join him, or watch what happens when he finally lets his masterpiece do what it was built to do. I looked at Ren. She looked back at me and nodded once, the way she used to nod at me back home, right before we did something our mother would absolutely have forbidden if she'd known about it in advance. I told Lord Kesh that he'd spent years building a monster to control me, and that he was about to learn the same lesson every failed experiment in that cage had already learned the hard way. Whatever he made, whatever he stole, whatever power he thought he could weaponize, it was never going to belong to him for very long. He pulled the lever anyway. The cage door tore open, and the thing inside it hit the ground running, faster than anything I'd absorbed before, and for one gut-dropping second, every old instinct from Dorian's life screamed the same warning it had at the fence line years ago. This one might actually be too much. I didn't run. Neither did Ren, though every survival instinct she had was probably telling her to. Instead, she moved exactly the way we'd planned on the walk here, ducking low, drawing the creature's attention just long enough with a thrown lantern that shattered against its shoulder, buying me the half-second I needed to close the distance and put both hands directly against its chest. The pull that followed was unlike anything before it. This wasn't one monster, or even a dozen stitched together by accident. This was a monster built on purpose, layered with the strongest pieces of everything Kesh's alchemists had ever managed to steal from the Hollow Reach, and it fought the drain with everything it had, screeching in that same dozen-voiced chorus, except louder now, angrier, more desperate. For a moment, I thought it would tear straight through me before the absorption finished. Then I felt something shift, deep inside my chest, past the hunger, past the curse, into whatever was actually left of Dorian Kestrel underneath all of it, and I understood, all at once, why this power had chosen me specifically out of every person it could have landed on. It wasn't just about taking what monsters had, it was about refusing to let cruelty like Lord Kesh's ever get the last word. The pull won. All at once, the way a held breath finally releases, the creature's power flooded into me completely, and its body collapsed into the same dried husk every other absorbed monster had left behind. Except this time, the hall went dead silent around it, because everyone standing there had just watched Lord Draven Kesh's greatest creation get erased in front of his own household staff. Lord Kesh didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally did speak, his voice had lost every ounce of the polite, generous tone he'd opened the meeting with. He called me a mistake his alchemists should have found a way to correct years ago, back when I was still small enough to correct quietly. I told him he was too late for that. I told him the entire hall had just watched exactly what happens to things built to control me. And I told him, quiet enough that only he could really hear it, that Ashcombe Hollow's taxes were done, effective immediately, and that if one more failed experiment ever crossed our tree line again, I'd walk back through his front gate and finish what I'd just started, with him standing exactly where his monster used to be. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The guards who'd moved to seize us minutes earlier were standing frozen instead, staring at the empty husk on the floor, and not one of them made a move to stop us, as Ren and I walked back out through the same front gate we'd walked in through, past Percival, who wouldn't meet either of our eyes, and out into a night that felt, for the first time in months, like it belonged to us instead of to him. We walked most of the way home in silence, the good kind, the kind that comes after surviving something you weren't fully sure you'd survive. Ren finally broke it about a mile from the village gates, asking me, quietly, whether I actually thought Lord Kesh would stop. I told her the truth. I didn't think men like that ever really stopped. I thought they retreated, licked their wounds, and came back with something worse, because pride like his doesn't survive being humiliated twice without wanting a third round on better terms. I was right to think that. I just had no idea, walking through our own village gates that night to find my mother waiting at the door with tears already streaming down her face, how much worse the third round was going to be, or how soon it was coming. Because 3 nights later, a raven arrived at our house carrying no message from Lord Kesh at all. It carried the seal of the Hunter's Order instead, the kingdom's own governing body for anything monster-related. The people who decided, officially, what counted as a blessing and what counted as a threat that needed to be put down before it grew any further. Someone had reported what happened inside that manor hall. Someone with enough reach to summon the order itself. Someone who wanted the story told exactly the way it would hurt me most. A 10-year-old boy who could erase Apex-class monsters and full-grown noble creations alike without leaving so much as a core behind for anyone to study, contain, or control. The letter that came with the raven wasn't an invitation this time. It was a summons, and reading the name signed at the bottom of it, an inquisitor of the order I'd never heard of, but whose title alone made my mother go pale, I understood that Lord Kesh hadn't retreated at all. He'd just found a much bigger monster to send after me instead.